Good evening, and welcome to American Public Square at Jewell. I'm Adam Erickson, Membership Coordinator for APS and roving reporter for this evening's program. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who made this program possible, including the American Public Square Program Committee, the Membership Committee, and all the staff and volunteers at APS. I would also like to thank our sponsors for tonight's program. It's William Jewell College, Marnie and John Sherman, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, and Plexpod. Tonight, we'll be speaking with veteran journalist Margaret Talev. Margaret is the White House and politics editor at Axios and a CNN political analyst. Tonight, she will be discussing her views on the media's role in addressing the current crises facing our country. She will be joined by American Public Square founder and CEO, Ambassador Alan Katz. As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome you to ask questions. I will be watching as a roving reporter for any questions you may have. So if you have something you would like to ask Margaret, please type it into the Q&A section of Zoom, or if you're watching through Facebook, please type it onto our official Facebook page and we'll answer it from there. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator for the evening.
Thank you very much, Adam. Margaret, welcome. It's nice to have you back at American Public Square. You have been with us. I think this is the fourth time you've been with us, and which sort of sets a record. And I want to welcome you to our new program, which we call Cocktails and Politics. So I'd like to start off by asking you to ask a question that I seem to always ask you when you come to one of our panels, and you always kind of push back a little when I talk about the media per se. But I'd like you to give me just sort of a sense, your sense of what role, if any, has the media played in making everything from COVID-19 through the George Floyd series of demonstrations? What role has the media played other than that of observer?
It looks like Margaret, we may have lost her for a moment. I don't know if her connection is bad or something. Let's see if we can get her back here in just a moment.
Why don't we see whether we can do that? That'd be good.
Can you guys see me?
Oh, we cannot see you, but we can hear you right now.
Okay.
Margaret, are you back?
I don't know. Let's see. Let's try it. Hang on.
Yeah, we have a picture of you, but it's frozen, so we don't. Okay, we're trying again. Sorry for this, everybody, but we are. There we are. Okay. So did you hear the pithy question that I asked you?
I did. Hi, everyone. First of all, I just wanted to say cheers. I made coffee, and then as we were setting up, they were like, "What are you doing? It's cocktails and politics." I'm like, oh, "Okay." So anyway, I'm having some coffee, and I have prepared an aperitif for after my coffee. But it's wonderful to be back, and like, I've always loved the idea of American Public Square, but I just think if you needed more evidence now more than ever that there needs to be a format for nonpartisan, bipartisan civil engagement, like, now's the time. So a nice, easy question to start with, right? What's the role of the press in covering what's been going on? And I would say this, like, the press has been hugely, deeply involved in covering the coronavirus aspect, and I think it's impossible to understand the public reaction to what has happened, to the killing of George Floyd and the series of other examples of police brutality and of just racism, like in society. It's impossible to understand those in context without understanding what had been happening with coronavirus. At Axios, we are very much like sort of a data and graphics and technology driven news company. And so a lot of the way that we have been covering the coronavirus is in terms of the numbers and the scope and the categories of American society and how the differentiation between how different Americans have been devastated. We do a poll every week with Ipsos, the global public affairs firm, and I'm like the editorial director in our newsroom for this poll. And so for 13 weeks now, we have been measuring how different subsections of America are experiencing the pandemic. And so week after week, I was watching these numbers just diverge in terms of how different socioeconomic groups are experiencing work, loss of work, or if they're able to keep their jobs where they work, their exposure to the illness, how many people they know who have gotten sick, who have died, their access to healthcare, their access to food, information about their children, about school, their levels of fear or emotional distress. And you could see these socioeconomic disparities break out. And it, by definition, definitionally, it will have an impact on how Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, white Americans are experiencing the pandemic. So many Americans are at home and they're watching the news like never before, as President Trump would say. They're watching the news and they're watching the coverage of this, and they have time to, if they're lucky enough to be home and if they're lucky enough to be employed, or if they're able to be unemployed and concentrate on the news, they're watching the coverage of this health and economic disparity crisis unfolding, where 2 or 3 different versions of America are getting sick and dealing with this. And then on top of that come all of these events. Ahmaud Arbery's killing, the episode with the woman and the dog and the birdwatcher in Central Park, Breonna Taylor, and then of course what happened with George Floyd. And like, I think that it was the underlying experience, not just the fact of the coronavirus, but people's ability to focus on that and to really understand those disparities, coupled with the wave of racial violence that has galvanized so many Americans. And I think the media has played a big role in that. There's also a second story, which is the coverage of the protests and the coverage of the demonstrations. And this is really a moment where a new generation of reporters, and reporters of color in particular, have been not only very moved and disturbed by what's going on, because it's very disturbing, but have been asking themselves, what does it mean to report on this? Can you, how do you draw the line between impartial or unbiased reporting versus sort of false equivalence? And so these are questions that are roiling the news industry, and you can watch it play out. But I think in our newsroom, we're not, our newsroom are not editorial columnists, we are mainstream news reporters. And so our politics team is writing about the demonstrations and the protests through the lens of news coverage, not through the lens of activist journalism. But this has just been a deeply moving, deeply disturbing national story. And it has been disturbing to people covering it as well as to Americans living through it.
So, let me sort of try to unwrap what you've just sort of said. I know I watch the news, and if I watch the news on CNN, and then I turn over to Fox and watch the news on Fox, it's like I'm in 2 different countries and they're reporting 2 different things. And then the other thing I find are the reporters you were just talking to, the news reporters from those 2 networks. When they're interacting with the people whose shows they are reporting to, whether it's Anderson Cooper or whether it is Tucker Carlson, clearly the views of, they do not come across as people who are objectively reporting what happened. They are clearly find themselves opining, if you will, about things. It's not a question that sort of says, okay, 14 protesters were moved from point A to point B. It is like it was done in order to clear the path for the president, so he had a photo op. And what that really, if you think about that,
because that is what happened in that case.
Well, first of all, we don't know. We know there was a clear. We know people were cleared out. We don't necessarily know why we presume how they were cleared out, but we really don't know that. Certainly at that moment, people didn't know it. They saw what happened afterwards, and so therefore they drew that conclusion. My only point really is that, and some would say, well, the protesters pushed back, whatever. It is one of those things where clearly it seems to be we have this it's very difficult to interact or to get information from a news source these days that does not come across as having a point of view that they're fitting the facts to. And the facts may fit in different times, but nonetheless, that seems to me very apparent.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're raising a really important point that is roiling America right now and is playing out in our newsrooms as well. And you could see it in terms of the struggle they've had inside the New York Times with their op-ed page, and reporters going public in some cases with their frustrations about longstanding kind of rules for reporters not showing emotion, kind of not putting their thumb on the scale. So these are discussions going on inside newsrooms right now, and I think inside journalism schools, and discussions that will affect the next generation of journalists. But to me, the reason for objectivity, and I think that if you are at your core a news reporter, the reason why it is important to be able to deliver facts and for your job to be that is a point that you just made, right? Is the idea that if you are tuning in because you want a trusted source of information, you want to be able to make these determinations yourself. And how do you do that? Does it help you when someone else is telling you how they see it or what they think, or it doesn't make it harder for you to make your own determinations? And part of the debate inside journalism now is if you attempt to just cover something without giving any political or emotional analysis to it, does that inherently suggest that there's such a thing as both sides, or that both sides have a good point? Are you giving cover to an individual or to groups that are doing something bad or something wrong if you don't proactively call them out in addition to reporting the facts? And this is a debate that everyone who is watching the news and reading the news can watch play out. But my own view, if that's what you're asking me about journalism, is that there is a real value in, and it's really hard to do because of course reporters have feelings and views about things. And when you're up close, you have some of the most information available to help you make your judgments. But there is a difference between being an editorial columnist or being a pundit and being a reporter. They're both journalism, but they're different kinds of journalism. And there still has to be some core availability of people who are attempting to leave their feelings and their emotions at the curb and take their notebook and go into a group that's demonstrating with a mask and gloves and attempt to capture what those people are feeling and what those people are thinking. But it is really hard to do if you are personally deeply affected. And we're all affected by what's going on, but we're affected in different ways. And if you're a person of color, you are experiencing the pandemic, the spate of violence, and the national protests, and the national conversation, and corporate America's reaction, and politicians' reaction in a different way than if you're a white American. You just are, and it makes it very, very challenging. And I think it's important for all of us to listen. I think it's important for all of us to listen, including journalists, but our primary job is to reach out to other people who are doing something, experiencing something, and to hear from them about their experience and to share those experiences with the public.
Okay. By the way, let me remind our viewers that you can put a question through by just going to the chat section, and Adam's there waiting there for them. So Margaret, let me sort of again pursue this. So we've talked about, in fact, there's been a great amount of focus over the last 2 weeks in the wake of the murder of George Floyd about institutional racism, not just in law enforcement, but in institutions throughout the country, in every walk of life. Let's talk just for a second about journalism. There was a time when if there was a Black journalist, it was sort of an oddity. There was Ed Bradley back on CBS News back in the day, and it wasn't like there were a large number people of color who were journalists. How has that, and you've been at this for about 20 years or so, how much has it changed, and what kind of institutional racism, sexism, et cetera, still exists within journalism as you see it?
It certainly has changed. I don't think it's changed as fast in political coverage as it has changed in some other sectors of American journalism. And just in my own experience covering national politics, it seems to have changed faster for women than it has for reporters of color. Certainly when I look around the White House briefing room or the campaign trail, I look at my colleagues who are competitors and friends. There are many reporters of color, but not enough. And with journalists of color and with women in journalism, the challenge continues to be at the higher levels of management and leadership. And that's so important because it is at those levels where decisions are made about not just tone and context, but what to cover to begin with. What is a news story? How long should it remain front and center in the news? It's easier to talk about these conversations in terms of TV just because it's so much more instinctive and visual for us. But if you have been watching TV throughout the coronavirus pandemic coverage, you know that at some point in March, this went from being an important story that was gaining increasing coverage to being the only story. It's the only story until the killing of George Floyd and the protests that sprang out of it. And now that is the dominant story. And so how long a story remains the key story and how it is covered are decisions that that happen all the way through the journalism ecosystem, but like is in any other company, like core key strategic decisions and decisions about hiring and decisions about direction of the company. Like for women and for journalists of color, it's really important to be able to achieve and sustain an equal place at those higher levels, and that's the big challenge for all companies, including news organizations.
Okay, so I'm going to switch to another topic now before we go to questions, and that is that Twitter recently decided that they were going to fact check the president's Twitter and presumably other politicians, whatever. So my question would be: so let's take the fact that there's the president and there's former Vice President Biden, the two presumptive nominees of their parties in the election this fall. What responsibility does the media have to correct them in real time? In other words, it's one thing to sort of say, a week later you publish or someone puts something out that says, oh, well, when so-and-so said this, they were wrong. It should have, these are the facts. Does the media, given its special privilege it gets under our First Amendment, do they have a responsibility to, particularly with technology available now, to immediately post facts that are being ignored?
The short answer to a really complicated question is yes. I mean, if you're going to publish assertions of fact and the fact is not correct, then it's on you to try to vet those facts or purported facts as quickly as possible and to correct the record. And I think over the last few years, you've seen especially larger newsrooms that really have the staffing ability. But to some extent, you've seen all newsrooms really try to beef up those sections, whether it's on State of the Union night or if there's going to be a major policy speech. And the other movement that you've seen inside news organizations is to be a little bit more judicious about going live to events where information may be presented that's not factual, like a rally, for example, or even a news conference with the principal or with the press secretary. At the beginning of the administration, very often these events would just be carried live and they might go on for an hour and a half or 2 hours. And you don't see that as much anymore. You see networks return to what had always been the longstanding practice for the most part of covering an event, being at the event, but not necessarily taking it live through its like sort of TBD duration. It is easier to vet facts and to be judicious about what you're going to air and to take information in and try to verify stuff when it's not happening in real time and live. Can't hear you.
Sorry. Adam, do you have a question from somebody watching?
Yeah, we got a question. And yeah, again, let me remind people, if you have a question for Margaret or just, anything, please put it into the Q&A in Zoom. If you're watching over Facebook, you can post it on there as well. Margaret, here's a pretty big one. You've been talking about how there's lots of different views of journalism, kind of this idea of objective versus maybe advocacy more. One of our viewers wants to know, he says, recognizing and representing background, bias, and commitment is a key piece of honest journalism. Journalism should be fact-based and truthful, which requires honesty as if not the key principle. So how can we start to, if you're assuming journalism has moved into strictly partisan, maybe totally to one degree or another, how can we start to kind of regain those ethics? And what would be your suggestion for maybe the future of journalism? How do we move back to a more honest, not necessarily purely objective, but a more honest and truthful way of the media doing its job?
I think that the reporters sometimes take for granted that the general public doesn't know every little thing about different news organizations or kind of the inside baseball of how journalism works. So I think part of that is for news companies or media information companies to have like mission statements that reflect what their beliefs are and how they approach the news. And the hard thing about talking to a journalist about the media is that there's not really one such thing that's a definition of the media. The media is a loose compilation of a lot of different organizations that have different missions and different points of view. And there are some news organizations like mine, like the Associated Press, like Bloomberg, where I used to work, like major newspapers who they're, in the case of a newspaper, the editorial board may have a point of view, but where the news side of the organization does not attempt to take a partisan or an ideological point of view or an advocacy point of view, and that the mission is to tell the news, is to be and unbiased to the extent possible, like portal for facts, and to do the analysis and the contextualization from the vantage point of what you believe to be true, not from what you want to be true or what you want people to be focused on. And then there's other media organizations that are point of view journalism that do have opinions and are more unabashed about audiences that they're catering to, and the lens through which they decide which stories to tell and how to tell them are directed by some of that. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. It's just a different mission than a traditional news organization. So I think for the reader or for the viewer, part of what's important is to know what you're watching or what you're reading and how it differs from a different source. And if what you're trying to get are facts from an organization that aims to be completely nonpartisan, then you can get that. And then also, if you are conservative, or if you're liberal, if you're progressive, like what have you, if there's a media organization that has a point of view, but that you think they're really smart and you respect what they're doing and you like their analysis, that's great. But it will look different. It's not necessarily that the facts will be different, but the focus may be different. And I think it's important to try to inform yourself about the source that you're seeking out for the information. And I think to that end, it's important for news and media organizations to try to be transparent about what they're trying to accomplish, who they're catering to, what kind of news they're pursuing, whether or not they want to have a point of view. And that can help you to try to figure out what you're getting.
Okay, Margaret, let me ask you this question. There's the expression that they use in basketball called working the refs, where essentially they're trying to coaches yell at the refs in a way to try to get a better break if there's a close call. Well, the same thing happens by politicians and the press, as you know. How prevalent is it and how successful is it?
It's prevalent.
Excuse me 1 second. I was going to give the best example I can remember from, which of course was before you were born, but in 1972, when Nixon was running for re-election, the Nixon campaign very successfully worked the press that they were anti-Nixon, which they basically were probably at the time. And as a result, poor George McGovern, with all the other problems he had in that campaign, the press also came down on him much harder, I think, because the Nixon campaign was very successful in, quote, working the refs. So how's that working these days?
I mean, as long as I've been doing journalism in as many different places, in Florida, where we first met, in California, in the nation's capital, every administration or power that I've ever covered has attempted to work the refs. It didn't matter if they were Democratic, didn't matter if they were Republican. One of the main differences, I have to say, is most of that working of the refs happened off camera and not for public consumption. And it was much more like in the form of a nasty gram or some phone call where somebody is just letting you have it, and it's expletive filled and it's shocking, and it can either be like very veiled, like, well, I think you really effed that up, or it can be like explicit, like, I am never talking to you again, and my boss is never going to talk to you again, and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's different than like what we've seen in the last few years is obviously like a whole new level of this, where our president is trying to like turn society against journalists and say that people, that facts can't be trusted and that no news organization can be trusted, trying to make the press like a national enemy. Like that's next level stuff, right? But I wouldn't say that it's more effective in terms of changing reporters' behavior. I think you could argue that it may be impacting the public's view of the press, which is not good and is worrisome. And it worries me not from it worries me on a lot of different levels. It worries me when I was leading the Correspondents Association, it worried me because I was really concerned about reporters' individual safety. I had some colleagues who were getting death threats. We would go to rallies and people would occasionally throw stuff at us. And I didn't want anyone to get hurt. And I still worry about that. And I worried about it downstream. I worried about people seeing it happen at the national level and then doing it at the local level. Like if you're a reporter and you're traveling inside the White House bubble, you're actually, you benefit from the kind of tertiary protection of the Secret Service. So you can travel pretty safely. If you're a reporter covering a council meeting in some state somewhere, you are not in any kind of a bubble. And if there's more, if any element of the public thinks it's acceptable to threaten reporters, use physical violence against reporters, like that worries me a lot. But also worries me for some of the kind of more big picture reasons, which is that when you take away the business part of it, because most reporters don't know that much about the business of journalism and are not profiting from the business of journalism, journalists really are an extension of the people. And the reason why journalists have this, help of the First Amendment is because journalists are representatives of individuals. Like you work all day. You don't have time to go to the White House and sit in a briefing and ask someone a question or to cover a protest and find out what people are thinking. And so journalists are supposed to be the eyes and ears of the public. And if journalists are stifled, or if people are told not to believe what the representatives of the public are saying, it's harmful for democracy. And it's harmful for good governance and for transparency and accountability. And then the third reason why I worry about it is because I worry about the implications in other countries, from Brazil to China to Russia and everywhere in between, the Philippines. And I worry that because of bigger trends than any of this, because of technology, because of disinformation and misinformation, there are already a lot of strains on the First Amendment. And if if individual citizens, if society doesn't value the First Amendment or doesn't hold it tight as a crucial right, it won't just be people who are working as journalists that are impacted downstream. It will be all of us, like our ability to speak freely, to have a clash of ideas, to organize around ideas, to hold power structures accountable, no matter who is in power. Like, all of that is much more fragile than it seems like it is. And that's why I worry about those issues.
Okay, Adam, you got a question for us?
Yeah, we had a question come in about kind of the rise of, maybe call it, citizen journalism. Especially over the past decade, we've seen everybody basically has a smartphone in their hand, has a camera. Much of the events, not just the death of George Floyd, but many other incidents leading up to it, were a result of people who just have cameras now. You see that with the protests, that a lot of our images of them are coming from, people streaming it online and things like that. In your experience, what have you seen with this rise of this new technology, and where do you think it's going from here?
Well, it's a great question. In this particular case, when it comes to police brutality and racial disparities and racial injustice, those cameras have been absolutely crucial in terms of showing the public what's going on and holding the people who have acted badly, the people in power who have acted badly, holding them accountable. And like in all of our reporting about this, it is a constant refrain, a constant return from people who have been affected personally by this, by people who are organizers and activists on police brutality issues, that the cameras and an ordinary citizen's ability, not just the dashboard cameras and that stuff, because as we all know, that only works if it's on and if it's disclosed, but individual citizens ability to show what has happened, and to correct stories that are told wrong, is like a fundamental game changer. So setting that aside, I think there are different, this is a complicated topic, because I think all of that's true and it's crucially important. I also think as we look at some of these longer term technological challenges for truth and for journalism, like disinformation and misinformation, you have to be able to verify and to validate video that is purporting to show something. You have to be able to, as a news organization, before you air something like that, you need to be able to verify that it is actual video of what it purports to be, and that hasn't been spliced. And we have seen already in the campaign, we've seen videos of Joe Biden that have been spliced for effect, where it seems like he's saying something that he didn't really say, and then they blow up on Twitter and all this kind of stuff. So that's a problem and a challenge. And then it's been a challenge for reporters. I think in the case of the White House and the press briefings, Mike McCurry, the old President Clinton's press secretary, used to always say that it was putting those briefings on camera that ruined the briefings. And with the Supreme Court, you saw that they moved toward the phone calls, but not the video. There is an element of, stagecraft or whatever that occurs when the cameras are on with politicians, and probably with my profession as well, where the conversation plays out with a little more flair and a little less substance, maybe than it might have. And you're conscious that the camera's on, and so it has a different news events or coverage of news events take on a different effect. And so I think it's a different question whether or not cameras and individuals exercising their right to film something real that's happening, whether that's been beneficial in terms of holding people accountable for disparities in law enforcement. Yeah, it's been a game changer. But are cameras being on all the time good for everything? Probably not. And I think the challenges when it comes to misinformation and disinformation are going to be like some of the great challenges of our profession in the years to come.
Okay, so Margaret, let me just take off from what you just talked about and ask you what to me is sort of an important question, which I imagine journalists are having to face. Can we expect what I would call in-depth understanding of the reporting on the structural racism that sort of seems to permeate our society and manifests itself most recently in this murder, but certainly not sadly not a unique occurrence? Can this be done by white reporters, or do we really need to have people who can feel it at an emotional level, at a real level, because it's, we had Jeff Rowe on Monday night here, and Jeff talked about how he grew up in a small town, and basically it never occurred to him being stopped by a policeman was an existential event. It was just sort of the way it was, and he understands that if you are an African American, your circumstance, your reaction to it, and the outcome of it may be vastly different for that reason alone. So my question is, from the media perspective, why would we believe that white people could understand this in a way and report on it sufficiently?
Yeah, I don't think that it can be done or should be done only by reporters who aren't of color. But yes, of course, I think it's possible for a reporter who is white to report about something that affects people of color, just the same way as a male reporter could report about something that has affected a woman, or you could be a reporter who's never served in the military and still report about something that happened to a service member. But you certainly couldn't do it with quite the same insight or awareness or instinct or nuance or what you would bring to it personally. And that's part of why this conversation that we were having earlier about diversity in newsrooms, from the reporters to the top leadership, is so important, because it's not just the reporters who are, that are doing the reporting, but it's those conversations that happen. If I'm working on a story, I'll often talk to my colleagues who might know more about that story or pieces about that story as I'm thinking through the reporting, who to talk to, what to think about, what questions to ask. And it's kind of that ecosystem in the newsroom that's really crucial. And there's so many elements to structural racism. It's about economy, it's about healthcare, it's about history, it's about culture, it's about the police. It's about power structures, it's about companies and Wall Street, and it's generational, and it's urban versus rural versus suburban. It's quantitative, it's qualitative, it's pervasive. And if you didn't think it was pervasive, you have learned in the last few weeks how pervasive it is. And so I think newsrooms are taking this seriously. I think many newsrooms will take it seriously after the news circus has moved on, as it always does from big events. Our newsroom is committed to in-depth, long-term coverage of structural racism now as an enduring issue to last past 2020. And we're developing a long-term coverage plan for that will touch on each of those areas that I just spoke about. And so that's an all-hands effort where we'll have economics reporters and healthcare reporters and people who cover politics and science and space and sports, all contributing to these stories. And some of them are African American and some of them are white. And it is a whole mix of reporters that I think will be talking a lot to each other. And I think one thing that we have learned from the last few weeks is how important it is for us to be talking to people who have had different experiences than we have, so that we have a better understanding of everybody's experience. We all thought we were living through the same pandemic. We're not. And anyone who is African American or has a friend or a loved one who's African American can tell you that separate from the coronavirus pandemic, there are just the everyday threats, especially if you're male, of your experiences with law enforcement every day.
Okay, thank you. Adam, you got another question for us?
Yeah. Alan mentioned earlier, you have the different media outlets, specifically, I think, like Fox and CNN and MSNBC, and you kind of, they seem to be divided along partisan lines. And so people kind of know if they're leaning one way or another. They know which one they want to watch and kind of which one they like. But, there's a huge amount of people who are either, maybe they don't vote or they have checked out of the political process. What is the media's role in kind of, either informing people or reaching out to people who aren't maybe the base or the normal viewer, given that most, if not all media has, profit incentives they have to meet, and maybe that's not, that isn't in line with that. But I guess, what is the media's role in trying to reach out to these people who maybe have checked out of the political process or don't align up naturally with one of the two parties?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raised a really important truth, which is that you can only inform people who you can reach. And how are you doing that? And so that is a real challenge. And it's also interesting because you mentioned voting. And I think there's a big question about how all of this is going to impact voter turnout. The kind of general conventional wisdom is that the risk, the threat, right, is lower turnout, because if the pandemic is still a healthcare issue, people may be more reluctant than before to vote, or lines may be longer because people might have to be spaced apart, all these various things. But also on the other hand, there is this whole wave of efforts to expand access to absentee voting and to make it easier to absentee vote in states that have the laws. But then on the other hand, there are efforts to make it harder to make it easier. And so there's a lot going on right now. And one question for voting rights advocates who try to reach disenfranchised voters is, will people be further disenfranchised by the violence? Will they be called to action by what happened to George Floyd and by the mass demonstrations in the streets? Or will they throw up their hands and say, it doesn't matter, nothing's ever going to change? I think we spent a lot of time talking about how journalists, at least how news reporters, how mainstream news organizations don't typically, or try not to put their thumb on the scale of a story. But actually, I think voting is a little bit different. I think voting is something that for many years, and particularly now, that you'll see mainstream news organizations through their coverage kind of trying to encourage people to vote, if that makes sense. Or at least trying to encourage people to make an affirmative choice about their right to vote, about their ability to vote. My personal view is, if you are registered to vote and you make a deliberate, conscious choice not to for some reason, that should be your right to do that. But then it should be something that you've thought about and a choice that you've made, and that you should have access to do it as long as you're legally allowed to do it. So I do think that journalists have increasingly taken on a role in covering voting access issues and in trying to help people get information about their polling station or how to register, or so on and so forth.
Okay, Adam, you got another? Adam,
Yes.
you have a question? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. When we were talking earlier about, the rise of, what do we call it, citizen journalism or something like that, you kind of talked about misinformation and disinformation. Something that I think people are running into more and more is, maybe you're on the internet and you see an article that you want to read and you click it and it's behind a paywall. As newspapers and media move away from that print journalism to a more online, obviously it makes sense that some places have to have payment structures for their articles and their news. But a lot of people will just turn away and they'll go to maybe some other news site that's perhaps less reputable, maybe even a lot of false news on there. But what's the goal moving forward, I guess? How can we reconcile the huge amount of information that may or may not be good quality information that's free, versus the more established sources that you may trust more, but people aren't willing to kind of pay for that? What do you think the future is there? What should, I guess, news organizations and the media do? And what is kind of our responsibility, I guess, or our prerogative as consumers for that?
Yeah, that's a tough, that is, you picked another tough question. It costs money to do good journalism. It costs money to pay people salaries and benefits. It costs money to to travel, whether the travel is around the world or whether the travel is to the Capitol building and back. It costs money to run the operation. And so it has to be paid for somehow. Like we were talking about the different kinds of media before, there are different ways that these newsrooms are structured. And there are some that look to endowments and nonprofits to support their work. And there are others that look to advertising and sponsors to pay the bills, and others that look more heavily to a subscription model. And that exists across all types of journalism, whether it's just like pure news or whether it's kind of news and opinion or more advocacy based stuff. I think every news organization has to find its own way and its own balance between how much of a firewall they want to put up for their business model. But I think it's absolutely possible, if you don't have the means to pay for journalism, it is absolutely possible to find good, reputable, reliable news that does not require that subscription for you to pay for it. Like at Axios, for example, you can sign up for our newsletters. They are free to subscribers. You do not have to pay to read Axios AM, where most of my team's stuff is featured, or any of our other newsletters. And so I think you're asking me an evolving question for which there isn't one answer. As the internet really took hold for news distribution, and you began to see print journalism, printed newspapers wane, and that shift began, there were real questions about how to monetize it and how to change the business model. And it's something that the industry is still going through, and it's been a real challenge for local news outlets. But local news is absolutely essential in order for people to have a full picture of news. Most of the news that happens to you happens in your community, and stories that are national stories begin in many cases as local stories, whether it's a local story that happens in Minneapolis, or a local story that happens in New York City, or a local story that happens in Louisville or in New Orleans. And so if you live in a town with a local news outlet that has a subscription service and you can afford to support your local newspaper, I hope that you will. I hope that you can. And I came up from local news. It's an essential part of the way we understand what's happening in our country.
Okay, Margaret, I would like to shift you over to something that happened within the last week. You referred to it earlier, which was the New York Times, and they published an op-ed piece by Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, which evidently caused great consternation among some folks and was, I guess, instrumental in the resignation of the editor of the editorial page of the New York Times, which arguably is, along with the Wall Street Journal, probably the most prominent editorial page in the country, although I guess the folks at the Washington Post might argue, but nonetheless, it's a very, very prominent perch. So my question to you is a little different than you might expect. We at American Public Square pride ourselves on the fact that we're not advocates, and what we do is we believe that people with different points of view, if they're willing to present them in a civil, fact-based way, ought to be able to sort of be heard. If instead of Tom Cotton's article, it had been Bernie Sanders' piece or AOC or someone from the left, which was more closely identified with the political philosophy expounded by the editorial page of the New York Times, do you think we would have had the same reaction?
You're asking me a really fair question, which I'm going to duck. But I'll tell you why I'm going to duck it. I'm just not, I don't work at the New York Times, either in the newsroom side or the editorial board side, and I don't know any more about this than you do from reading about it. But I do think it's important for our viewers, who are watching us tonight, to understand there is a difference in the way, when newsrooms are structured, there is a difference between the newsroom and the editorial page side. And there's a difference between the editorials of a newspaper and the op-ed page, which is meant to juxtapose opposing views and bring different insights in. Now, their internal procedures, everything that happened, I have read these stories as you have. I have friends at the Times. I know this has been gut-wrenching for the news organization. But I would just say, like, that not to conflate the reporting that you see on the front page and in the news sections with the discussions and the debates that you see playing out on the editorial page and the op-ed pages, because they have different leadership and different decision making, and there is a traditional firewall between the news and the editorial sides. And I think that's something that a lot of readers don't know, and they just think of the news part of a newspaper as matching the kind of editorial slants of the newspaper, and that's not actually how newspapers have traditionally been operated. They're different pieces.
Well, I appreciate you're trying to duck the question, but I'm going to
direct about that, I think.
But I want to keep at it.
By ducking, okay.
I don't want to keep at it, not to put you on the spot, although I don't mind doing that. But realistically, because I think this is an important point. I think first of all, the point you made, which is a very important one, which is the news and the editorial coverage. The Wall Street Journal is probably the best example that I can think of. They have a very conservative editorial page, and I think they have one of the better news organizations in terms of covering the news. But I do keep going back to this idea, and when I read the Cotton editorial, my own personal reaction to it was not particularly favorable. But that is sort of beside the point. I thought it was good that they ran it because it was a different point of view from someone who's been very vocal in these areas since he's been in the United States Senate. And I'm sort of distressed by the outcome. And I don't know the particulars either, but I don't believe that if it had been someone on the left, who maybe there were some factual errors or some, emphasizing some things in a particular way that were not particularly in conformity with certain facts from long ago, the reaction would have been the same. What do you think?
I'm holding to my previous here. But look, but if this is helpful, let me say this. Like, I think what you're asking is a real question, and I think it's a question that's playing out inside newsrooms as well as on this call. And I think in our society now, like, we have come to expect instant everything, in part because of Twitter and technology. And some of these answers are not instant. And some of the ways that newsrooms are trying to respond and modify and listen to younger generations of reporters and evolving consumer tastes, these are not decisions that can be executed flawlessly on the first try. It is going to take some time and some effort. And I know your ideological point of view, and probably so does everyone else on the call. And so for you to say what you're saying, reflects that this is not as simple as whose side are you on will dictate how you think the institution should have played it. That it's much more complicated and much more nuanced than that. And it is, again, this balance between people wanting help making decisions and synthesizing information, but also people wanting to be able to get access to information. And I think it's complicated. And I think you have seen, in the case of a sitting senator or anyone who's been elected to office, they have the ability to make these comments in multiple venues, like in the Senate, or give a speech or what have you. And they have traditionally viewed the op-ed page as just another venue where they can make a statement that they might also make on the Senate floor. So I just think this is going to be a discussion that goes on well beyond this phone call, and that when people like you are raising the points that you're raising, that it's going to be something that not newsrooms, but editorial boards in this case, or op-ed pages, are going to have long, heartfelt conversations about. But I also think there does seem to be a generational shift in terms of expectations from journalists, but also from news consumers, like what people think they should be getting from the news, what people want to be getting from reporters, what people's view of a journalist is. And I was born in 1972. I was born a week before the Watergate break-in. I came of age with a generation of journalists who were called to action in terms of political journalism by the hangover from the Nixon era. And for a lot of the journalists who are coming of age now and who are young adults who are in their 20s, in some cases they were called to journalism because of structural racism, because of injustice in society that many of us thought we understood and realized a few weeks ago that we didn't understand as well as we thought we did. So I just think if you're asking like what were the old rules of journalism, yes, the old rules were that a senator can submit an op-ed and it would run because they're a sitting US senator. But I think there is a national conversation where people want to be heard and debate these issues.
Yeah, okay, and I'm going to go to a question now that from Adam. Before we do that, the only comment I've got is that the New York Times was under no obligation to run the piece, and they chose to run the piece. And that seems to be that once that happened, you kind of, the reaction to it, it has to be different than if you choose not to run the piece, which is a whole different set of questions you might want to ask. Adam, what do you got for us? We're going to do the interview, so go ahead.
I got another one. So, obviously, President Trump has a certain relationship with the media. It's part of his rhetoric. He's talked about it since, before even the primaries. What is your experience as someone who has been close to him as a, reporter? Does he, is all the fake news, does he actually really feel that way? Do you think that he has, I guess between the various media outlets, people just want to know what's your experience having worked with him directly kind of as a journalist?
Yeah, you mean having covered him with,
yes.
Having interacted with him personally?
Exactly.
Yeah, I've had a couple of sit-down interviews with President Trump. I've been covering him since the transition and since he took office. And some of my colleagues have been covering him for more than 20 years. And so they know him even better. But in general, it is what it looks like. He is a profoundly instinctive politician with kind of a showman's flair, and one of his driving guiding principles is that you're losing if someone's talking about someone else and you're winning if they're talking about you. And so he is constantly looking for a flashpoint, a wedge, a moment of controversy that will keep the news fresh. He has a keen understanding of the way modern news cycles work and how to, I won't say how to control the narrative because it doesn't always work, but at least how to drive the narrative and how to make the narrative about what he wants to talk about. And for many politicians, I think welcome periods of time when the country is focused on things other than what they are doing. He does not. And if it goes more than like 3 days and the story is about something else, his team's doing something wrong. So that's what you see driving a lot of this. Like you were asking me, how does he really feel about reporters? I don't know. I mean, I would never presume to get into somebody's head. I don't think he's thinking about it that way. I think he's thinking about him and the coverage he's driving and what the messaging is. And look, obviously, I mean, I have one story that I tell sometimes, and it's like a 3-year-old story, and I'm gonna tell it again because it's a good story. A month or two into his presidency, we were flying to Florida. He was supposed to give a speech in Orlando at an airport hangar. And on the flight down, he was just railing about, he came back on the plane, he was railing about something. And I stopped him and I said, Mr. President, many of us have never met you before. It was the first time I'd met him and talked to him in person. And I said, could we just take a minute and introduce ourselves so you can get to know the press corps that's going to be covering you? His demeanor completely changed. He started shaking each of our hands, asking us our names. And he would do something like, oh yeah, I know your outlet. Or like, oh yeah, I used to read your stuff. Or he was familiar with a lot of the names and people. He was very friendly. He became a host, kind of telling us about the airplane, welcoming us to his his plane, the taxpayer's plane, Air Force One. And we said, what are you going to talk about in your speech when you land? And he said he was going to talk about how unified the country was and how almost everyone was working in a unified manner with one exception. And we said, what's the exception? And he wouldn't tell us. And then the plane landed and we all stepped off on the tarmac and we got into the hangar and he gave his speech, and it turned out that we were the one part that wasn't unified. He gave a speech railing against the press and what jerks and idiots we were. And the same people who we had met while we were lining up to hear the speech and like shaking hands with and taking names and numbers and quoting them for our story, why did you come to hear the president? Same people turn around and started shaking their fists at us. And so like, I'm smiling about it, but I don't think it's funny. Like it's obviously makes it difficult to work and it's bad for democracy and stuff, but there is a show quality to it that is not really about whether he likes or respects a reporter. It's about whether he is getting the coverage that he wants. And I don't think that will surprise a lot of the people on this call, because we have all experienced, whether you're holding the pen and you're in the White House or whether you're watching this from your living room, we have all lived the last few years and witnessed a politician who's truly different than most presidents, regardless of party, that in our lifetimes.
Well, Margaret, I think we've just run out of time, and I really want to thank you. I'd love to ask you a couple more questions about the New York Times editorial board, but
yeah, that'd be really great.
I know, but we don't seem to have enough time. And I do want to thank you very much for being part of our Cocktails and Politics, being now a 4-time guest in American Public Square. I think we're going to get you a second bell, because you probably need one with John and Abby anyway. But I think that the insight that you've offered to our viewers and the people who will watch once we posted this on our website is very helpful, because they don't get an opportunity to talk to one of the top journalists in the country on a regular basis. And so I want to thank you very much. And Adam, let me turn over the thing. Before I turn it over to Adam, I will steal one of Adam's lines, which is, if you like what you've seen, if you think what we're doing matters, go to AmericanPublicSquare.org, become a member. We need your membership, both in terms of the dollars and just in terms of the adding your name to a list of people who are advocating for what we're doing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
Thank you, Alan, for that. And thank you, Margaret, again, for an excellent discussion. I'll add on to what Alan said. We actually just announced a new summer campaign. If you purchase a membership now through the end of August, you will get a free membership to give to someone else. So you're really getting a 2-for-1 deal. Also, if you enjoyed this program, coming up on June 16th, we're going to have the first in our 3-part virtual series that's called From Resistance to Resilience, the Mental Health of KC Residents, where we'll explore the root causes of mental illness in our community and how we can find ways to meaningfully address them. Again, that program will be on June 16th. The first episode, or the first program, is called Socioeconomics and Trauma, and it'll explore the relationship between socioeconomic status and trauma. Also check out the At the Square series of digital podcasts. These are something that Ambassador Katz and Mike McShane have been doing. They bring in community leaders and we talk about issues that are going on from kind of both sides of the aisle. Additionally, if you like this Cocktails and Politics, we will have Representative Kevin Yoder coming on June 24th. So please join that. He'll be talking about his views on the Republican Party, the upcoming election, and what he's seen going on lately. Additionally, when this ends, we'll have a link to a short survey. Please fill these out, as they help us improve our programs. They show us what we're doing right, what we could be doing better, and kind of what topics you would like to see. Since Alan already did the membership part, I will once again just say it. If you're not a member of American Public Square, I urge you to become one. Our members help support everything they do, everything we do. They help put on these programs and keep all these conversations flowing. With that, I would just like to say thank you one more time for joining us. We hope you have a good evening, and we hope to see you at the next event.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Bye. Bye-bye.